going to be giving us a lecture at 10 as usual. And on Tuesday next week, Ginger Chun, who is a visiting fellow at the center this semester, and will be with us also for the whole year, because it will stay longer next semester as a visiting scholar. We'll also be giving a lecture. So we're looking forward to these 2 lectures today. It's my really great pleasure to introduce Konrad Werner, who is assistant professor at the University of Warsaw Department of Philosophy. And I saw on the HPS website, Department of Epistemology.
Yes, something like that. There's a quite complex connection between institutes, faculties, and departments.
Okay, so it's interesting.
Please don't ask me to explain.
Konrad works in a range of areas around the philosophy of perception, philosophy of mind, philosophy of consciousness, but also metaphysics. He has is visiting the Department of History, philosophy of science now. And he has published widely on issues related to inactivism, embodiment. The last thing I wanted to mention is that his book is still forthcoming, but should be published by the end of the year.
Yes.
I checked the publisher today. It's The Embodied Philosopher, Living in Pursuit of Boundary Questions, and it's going to be published by Padre Macmillan by the end of the year. And we're looking forward to this book. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Edward, and thank you all for coming here, for your presence. It's a great pleasure for me, as I'm going to venture into a new territory. I mean, new to me, not new as such. Initially, I wanted to say something. I wanted to draw a line or show you the connection between my older stuff having to do with embodied cognition and ontology of embodied cognition, however strange it must sound, but please don't run away. I am not going to talk about it. But then I realized that it would take like half of this presentation to draw this connection. So I decided that it would make no sense. And I will go directly to the new territory. And it's a very early stage of development of this project. So I'm going to talk about institutions. Does this thing work? Oh. Something. Oh, anyway, I will going to talk about institutions sooner or later.
Sorry, now?
Oh,
there we go.
Okay. Okay, so over the last 30 years or so, institutions have become fashionable. The term itself is, of course, much older than that. But as I said, last 30 years or something like that, you cannot even try to explain why certain nations or states prosper while some others do not, without mentioning institutions. So generally in the literature, we have 2 positions about what institutions are. This is the rule-following view, which is, let me put it this way, the default position in institutional economics, and so-called equilibrium view. And today I'm going to talk about the rule-following view only, and I have certain reasons for that. I can give you these reasons during the Q&A session, if you like, but this is my major concentration today. So according to this default position, namely the rule-following view, to put it simply, institutions are systems of rules or norms imposed on our behavior. And this is the famous slogan coming from Douglas North, that they are the rules of the game of society. And now the alternative is that institutions are solutions to repeated coordination and cooperation. Games, this view is inspired by game theory, but as I said, I will not address this conception here. So when it comes to this rule following view, there are several problems with it, and I'm going to mention only some of them. And surprisingly, little, or perhaps not so surprisingly, but let me say surprisingly little is the attention paid by philosophers working on institutions in so-called social ontology in particular, to implementational problems, if it can be expressed this way. Meaning how this or that conception of institutions is supposed to work, and how it is supposed to describe the actual institutional dynamic in the world. So my perspective, or my angle, let's say, my standpoint differs from these purely theoretical approaches, because I want to start from these implementational problems, and then try to do something more metaphysical. After all, this is my major inclination to do some metaphysics, but better start from something more concrete. So, and especially when it comes to this rule following view, assessing its utility, let's say, is extremely difficult, because at some point in the 1970s and then through 1980s, it became sort of rationale for certain international organizations such as the World Bank, the IMF, when they started to impose pressure, especially on developing countries, to implement certain, as they call it, institutions. So better institutions or better laws, basically they mean better laws. And this included mostly liberalization of the financial market, liberalization of real economy as well, and strict intellectual property rules to protect big business, to put it bluntly. And there is a huge bulk of literature about it, so I'm not going to bore you with this, but the point is that at many occasions, these attempts supposedly dedicated to making these countries' economic opportunities better simply failed. So this is a sad fact. And now, I guess that it's a reasonable strategy to ask why they failed. And here I'm going to refer to Ha-Joon Chang. I'm not sure to what extent my pronunciation is correct. A quite famous economist from the University of Cambridge, but originally from South Korea. And he draws our attention to the issue of, to the problem of demand. And he writes something like this. Let me read it. Economic development changes institutions through a number of channels. First, increased wealth due to growth may create higher demands for higher quality institutions. Second, greater wealth also makes better institutions more affordable. Institutions are costly to establish and run. This is a very interesting remark. Third, economic development creates new agents of change, demanding new institutions. In the 18th century, the rising industrial capitalists supported the development of banking against the opposition to it by landlords, while in the 19th and 20th century, the growing power of the working class led to the rise of the welfare state and protective labor laws against the capitalists who thought those institutions would bring about the end of civilization as they knew it. End quote. Sounds familiar. This end of civilization. So, yeah, this is a very interesting quote. And this issue of demand is crucial here. So, if there is no demand, you cannot have a successful implementation of a rule or of an institution. So, it's no surprise that, for example, the institution of intellectual property remained only on paper, or it was a real burden on societies, in all those places where there was no real demand for this kind of institution, namely intellectual property laws. And we should not blame all these people that they did not feel the urge to implement intellectual property laws, because these property laws are controversial by themselves. And the history of intellectual property laws in the West is also quite complex. In the 19th century, there was a consensus that at some point that they are against the free flow of intellectual activities and innovation, whereas just 2 or 3 decades later, these very same people, at the moment when they were able to gather, to round up, as it were, some portions of these technological ideas, they came to the conclusion that we have to protect them in order to protect our benefits. And so this history is quite tricky, and it shows that the issue of demand is really crucial. So that said, we can read Chang's remark in at least 2 different ways. So one way is that first you need to have a demand, and then there comes an institution answering this demand. So institutions come second, not first. But there is a different reading as well, that there are certain institutional factors making room for demands, and then institutions thought of as rules can come on stage as well. But first, there had to be some institutional factors that make it possible for people to have a demand or various demands. And this is actually the route that I decided to take, or I should say to try, because I'm not, all these things that I will be saying here are not my firm beliefs, let's say, but all of them are routes that I would like to try. So I would like to try this particular route, the second option. Now, the question is how it is possible to have a demand, let's say, in this purely economic sense of the term. So there is a certain missing aspect or a certain flaw, perhaps, in otherwise very, very appealing remark made by Chang. Namely, he seems to be suggesting that these demands are somewhere there, or somewhere in the air, or lying on the street and just waiting to be picked up. So it's like something like that, like if these demands were created by facts on the ground without any mediation coming from our cognition. And I think that this is highly unlikely. So I will put it this way. There must be a cognitive link between a certain fragment of the world and the formulation of a demand. And this may sound trivial to all of us here, of course, but okay. This is the issue of cognitive availability, or cognitive accessibility, perhaps should be better. I'm not so much dedicated to the term itself, so we just need to name it somehow. So this remark that I have just made may be not so trivial when we realize that this cognitive availability of certain things as things that might be demanded may be a function of institution. So at a certain relatively complex level of interactions in society, this cognitive availability may be a function of institutions. And if so, I would argue, or this is my hypothesis, we cannot assume cognitive availability as part of our account of what an institution is. On the contrary, it belongs to the nature of institutions that they make this availability possible. And this is my slogan. It's good to have a slogan. Institutions are enablers of cognitive availability of certain entities as goods, as things that might be demanded. Okay. Now, this puzzle of cognitive availability is, in my understanding, a major, a fundamental, or perhaps even the fundamental problem of cognitive science. I'm not going to dig into it, but just to take some examples, the issue of how the cognitive, the representational system makes it the case that proximal stimuli stand for something else, for a distal entity. It's a remarkable capacity. So how the cognitive system manages to do so, how it evolved to possess this capacity. This is, let's say, from the bottom up perspective. But if we think of it from the top down perspective, and I mean quite literally, we can go downstairs to the philosophy department and ask John McDowell, and we will learn that there are certain conceptual, categorical frameworks that need to be imposed on our perception, our experience, in order to make this experience intelligible. It's a Kantian idea, of course. So this is the crucial thing in our thinking of cognition. However, what I want to focus on is what might be called social cognitive availability. And I wanted to illustrate this idea by means of 3 examples, but I will mention just one of them because of obvious reasons, namely time limitation. And to begin with, I said that institutions are enablers of cognitive access or availability, but sometimes they are disablers. They disable, not enable. And actually, a short analysis of these disabling mechanisms should give us the sense of how important the problem of cognitive availability at this social level is, and that it may indeed be a function of institutions. So, as I said, I will mention just one thing, and then we can perhaps go back to the second issue, namely so-called epistemic decolonization in the Q&A, if you like to do so. So here's the issue of epistemic injustice. And Miranda Fricker, who's a major figure in this field of inquiry, distinguishes between testimonial and hermeneutical injustice. And I will focus here on the hermeneutical case. And Elizabeth Anderson, in her paper in the journal Epistemic, if I remember this correctly, gives a nice characterization with an example in one paragraph. So I decided to bring it up here. So hermeneutical injustice occurs, she writes, when a society lacks the interpretative resources to make sense of important features of a speaker's experience because she or members of her social group have been marginalized in meaning-making activities. For example, prior to the introduction of the concept of sexual harassment into public discourse, people tended to interpret women's discomfort, offense, and trauma at unwanted sexual advances at work and school as hysterical reactions to innocent flirtation. And here's the crucial point. Sexually harassed women suffered hermeneutical injustice because they lacked the interpretative resources to make sense of the injustice they were suffering, end quote. And this is a radical example, so it's quite risky to play with it, but this is the way, here is the way in which I understand it. So one thing is the credibility of the harassed women's testimony, which happened to be questioned in the past as well. But an even more fundamental issue here is the victim's lack of an appropriate conceptual framework to express her experience. Therefore, the harm being made to the harassed women may not have been articulated clearly by these very women. This is the crucial point. Even if they did have, obviously, a feeling that something was profoundly wrong. And this means exactly that a certain critical good, in this case, critical safety and sanctity of human body, was not perceived as a good in a sufficiently clear way as to demand a major social change. I mean, in the past. Okay, so natural question, now this is the second example. Natural question comes to mind. What is the cause of epistemic injustice and all other forms of making cognitive or epistemic availability impossible? And quite a natural answer is power and power structures. So here we have the more or less standard distinction used in economics, and not only economics and social sciences, between the state or the elite or the capital holders versus society, the people, workers, labor force. We can give many different names to one general distinction. I would argue that this is one general distinction here, but I will not waste my time to do so. So there is this distinction, and there is a certain dynamic of power between two sides of this distinction. It's a regular thing, nothing new. And Acemoglu and Anderson and Robinson in the recent book, very famous book, The Narrow Corridor, which actually inspired parts of this presentation, they bring this distinction to explain how certain nations, societies were able to develop this, what they call narrow corridor between the power of the state and power of society. But instead of power, I will concentrate on a different dynamic, the one having to do with epistemic dependence, not so much power. And therefore, a more familiar distinction will be useful here, namely between experts and non-experts. I would argue that this is still the same distinction, basically, but in a different rendering. So let's say that we have this distinction between experts and non-experts. Okay, so how much time do I have? Oh, enough, I guess. So here's the definition of epistemic dependence that I found in Sandy Goldberg's paper, but it would be quite painstaking to read all these things. So let's suppose that we have our two Polish friends, Tadeusz and Bolesław, and Tadeusz epistemically depends on Bolesław or the community, but let's stay with his friend Bolesław. So when he epistemically depends on Bolesław, variations within the epistemic states of Bolesław make it for some variations of the epistemic states of Tadeusz, which means that the epistemic states of Tadeusz are, if I get it correctly, sufficient. They provide a sufficient explanation of a certain change in the epistemic attitudes of his friend Bolesław. So let's suppose that this is remotely understandable, this idea of epistemic dependence. However, instead of the doxastic approach adopted by Goldberg and by most epistemologists, I will adopt a different perspective, namely erotic one, which means having to do with questions. Okay, let me put my notes in order. Okay. So I follow here in this erotic approach to epistemic dependence, the so-called logic of questions or erotetics. And since we are here in Pittsburgh, I have to mention Belknap and Rescher, of course, who contributed to the field, and also three philosophers, logicians, and linguists from Poland, and partly from Poland because Henry Hirsch emigrated to the US at some point. However, there is once again a big bulk of literature about it, and so I'm not going to dig into it, but there will be certainly a question why this erotic perspective should be adopted here. And here is the answer, the most straightforward answer. Note that the core of this cognitive availability is the problem of what is or can be problematized. Thus, as if pointed to, distilled from this immeasurable muddle of facts and highlighted in some sense as an issue, as a topic, as something we want to cognitively fathom. And this example of sexual harassment also works here. There was some state of affairs in the world, but it was a certain achievement, cognitive achievement, that we were able to point to this particular state of affairs, problematize it, conceptualize, and so on, and then begin to work on it. So this issue of problematization is quite mysterious, but at least we know that these acts of problematization frequently, not only in this sense, in this form, but frequently manifest themselves in the form of questions, to put it simply. So that's why. And yeah, so here is a commercial break, namely in this book. In this book, I try to say something about these acts of problematizations, as also about questions and let's say the logic of questions, especially in the field of meta philosophy. Okay, and break. I had to do it, sorry. So now I would say that this erotic approach is not against the doxastic, but rather it completes the doxastic approach. And here I draw particularly on the proposal coming from Jonathan Schaffer and his idea of contrastive knowledge. And the example is mine, not his, but it shows what it is all about. So suppose that I take one of you, ask a few questions, and it turns out that X, whoever that X might be, knows that the Polish writer Andrzej Sapkowski wrote the Witcher series, and not the American writer George Martin, who wrote a different piece, as you know. And if that's the case, it's something, it's okay, fine. But if it turns out that X knows that the Polish writer Andrzej Sapkowski wrote the Witcher series, and not another Polish writer, for example, Jacek Dukaj, then it's much more impressive. I would say I would be impressed. And here's the proof that actually Andrzej Sapkowski wrote The Witcher. You can see Henry Cavill in this great white wig. And here is Schaffer. So please focus on Schaffer, not on Henry Cavill. And his general characterization. So S knows that P as the true answer to Q. We have such a situation, and he says that it is not enough to know that P, one must know P as the true answer. In other words, it is not enough to know the proposition or the proposition that just so happens to be the answer. One must know the answer as such. Okay, so now I would define a special kind of epistemic dependence, namely, let's call it erotic dependence. And now let's go back to our friends. Tadeusz depends on Bolesław in the relevant sense. When Tadeusz depends on Bolesław, Tadeusz's ability to problematize a certain thing or phenomenon in his surroundings, in particular to ask a question, at least in part depends on his friend Bolesław's ability to problematize things in their common surroundings, let's say. Okay, so let's suppose that this is at some level, intuitive level at least, understandable. Of course, if we are to provide a more technical characterization of this, we should speak of desiderata of questions, because all these more formal theories of questions teach us that each question has a desideratum attributable to it, and then actually we should provide some kind of measure of quality of desiderata. But it's not so relevant here, at least for this moment. It is very much relevant for the whole project. So let's suppose that we understand this idea. And now we can, going back to our distinction between experts and non-experts, we can ask about how and when experts erotically depend, so in terms of their questions, on non-experts. And a more standard version when non-experts depend on experts. Okay. Let me once again put my notes in order. Okay. So here is the risky part of this presentation. Without any further delay, I want to describe a certain theoretically postulated optimal balance. And this balance is inspired by Acemoglu and Robinson's notion of the narrow corridor, although with different variables. A certain theoretically postulated optimal balance in the domain of experts, non-experts, erotic dependencies. And it may be depicted in the following way. I'm perfectly aware that this is a very primitive depiction, and it is not supposed to be any technical posit, but just an illustration or perhaps a heuristic. And now let me just explain briefly what we are dealing here with. So time is one variable, it's hardly controversial. And another thing is what I call here resolution, just for the lack of a better word. So it means that our questions can be more or less fine-grained, detailed, acute. I hope that you know more or less what it could be about when it comes to this resolution of questions. Okay, so here is the key take from the picture. Suppose that at point t0, a certain problem or issue is distinguished by non-experts. Perhaps the problem stands out so clearly that it took very little cognitive effort to notice it. So between t0 and t1, experts are not there yet. So this is this introductory period, let's say. And now I propose that the corridor, I will stick to my notes because otherwise this presentation will disarray completely at this point. So I propose that this corridor or window between points t1 and t2 stands for the period at which experts are epistemically, in terms of question, dependent on non-experts when it comes to their questions or acts of problematization. It can be called the corridor of trust. And why, I will say in just a minute. This is the period when the resolution of the questions formulated by non-experts exceeds, surprisingly or not, the resolution of the question posed by experts. And how are we supposed to understand this situation? So first, let me point out the utility, if I can put it this way, of the erotic approach as distinguished from the doxastic one. Here, it is not claimed that the beliefs or claims made by experts are less fine-grained, since this would undermine the very core of their expertise. The core is to have conceptual frameworks and other cognitive tools that capture the world in greater detail to be able to discover lawful relations and so on. Yet it is an imaginable scenario that this whole specialized expert cognitive machinery needs some time to warm up, as it were, to regroup and to create new tools before it will be able to attack a new problem full front. And therefore, during this period, their questions are not so fine-tuned. They're kind of introductory. Meanwhile, non-experts might have been facing this problem for a quite long time, perhaps even hundreds of years, before experts took notice of it, and therefore their acts of problematization, even if it is spelled out in everyday terms, perhaps even by means of metaphors, various stories, may be able to grasp more important aspects of the problem that they are facing. And now a good example comes from the epistemic decolonization literature that I decided to skip, but it's making its comeback here. So it's sorry. It's all these masks. Okay. I succeeded in the task. So it's an anecdote, but quite telling. One author brings up a personal story, harking back to the 1970s when he, after he had obtained a PhD in management from an American university, he went back to India and he would meet people in the province of Rajasthan, if I'm pronouncing this correctly, who, despite lacking any kind of formal education, were, in his assessment, more knowledgeable regarding local agriculture, organization methods, than he was. And the author was Rajesh Tandon, and inspired by this experience, he would then create an organization called Society for Participatory Research in Asia, whose goal was to preserve and implement the indigenous people's knowledge and enable them to contribute to addressing local, and this locality here is crucial, local concerns such as agriculture, water supply, healthcare, and so on. So my reading of this case is that the local people had initially a way better recognition of these local issues than even best educated Western scholars. This means, in my reading, that they asked better questions. They problematized their local surroundings, their local environment much more acutely. And now going back to the framework, we can also say that this corridor of trust between T1 and T2 is the time where the experts are, in a sense, nourished. And quite literally, by the way, for this is also the time where society funds research without knowing whether it will yield any benefits. So that's why it makes perfect sense to speak of trust here, I guess. Now, okay. As mentioned, beginning with T2 of this somewhat simplified picture, the resolution of the questions articulated by experts goes rapidly up, exceeding those attributable to non-experts, which means that experts finally tuned their complex cognitive machinery and finally got ready to attack the problem with all the sophisticated capacities they have. And from that point on, the epistemic dependence shifts, and now non-experts depend erotically, so in terms of questions, on experts. And in practice, this means, in our optimal scenario, of course, that there are various means and channels by which the high-resolution problematizations made by experts are transmitted to non-experts so that the non-experts can inform their acts of problematization with some portion of expert knowledge, and therefore they can also experience a period of a more or less rapid but potentially consequential increase in the resolution. And this red line, so the red line is stands for the experts, and the blue line stands for non-experts. So the red line pulls up, as it were, the blue line, and I would argue that it is of a paramount importance how much the red line is able to pull up the blue line, thereby informing everyday decisions made by non-experts. And for example, when prices go up, we can all experience that. Yet, being aware of how economists problematize inflation does not require non-economists to master the math behind the relevant models, but if there are some channels of communication, it can influence the investment decisions made by non-experts regarding things like buying a home, stocks, or obligations, and so on. So the space between T2 and T3, somewhat poetically, can be called the corridor of enlightenment, for this is something like the Enlightenment ideologues imagined. Yet re-articulated in more realistic terms, namely in terms of questions, problematizations, and relevant epistemic dependencies. And now, since I have 7 minutes left, let me say a bit more about why concentrating on questions and not beliefs or claims is preferable. It has a major advantage in the following sense. Just note that demanding that the expert's beliefs or claims should be epistemically dependent on the non-expert's beliefs would be a non-starter, for the whole point of being an expert is knowing more or better than non-experts. After all, experts are skilled in highly demanding cognitive endeavors such as physics or medicine, and they cannot doxastically, they cannot depend on those who do not share their expertise. On the other side, demanding that the beliefs of non-experts should be epistemically dependent on the claims made by experts would be unrealistic, for non-experts invest their resources, such as time in the first place, into different endeavors, and therefore cannot stop taking care of their own business and learn particle physics. The whole point of having a division of epistemic labor is to make the society as a whole effective without the ideal of everybody knowing everything. However, and this is my crucial point, the epistemic dependence of questions or problematizations is different. The idea that problems that non-experts are concerned with should be in this corridor of trust transmitted to experts means nothing else but a quite commonsensical requirement that experts should not be decoupled from the rest of the society, that they either should be considered proper parts of the society or that they signed a social contract with the society and so on. And I am especially thrilled that the talk by Professor Douglas will be this week on Friday, if I'm not wrong, because this can be, my whole talking can be an introduction to our Friday talk. I hope that it can serve in this way. So on the other side, the epistemic dependence of non-experts on experts in terms of questions does not impose the unrealistic and frankly counterproductive demand of acquiring expert knowledge if you have many other things to do. It's a much more imaginable and desirable scenario in which non-experts, thanks to some reasonable effort, of course, can have a better grasp of the complexity of the world, which is a valuable thing in itself, and therefore a better overview of possible scenarios of various actions and decisions they are about to make in their lives. In other words, the key thing is not so much that non-experts know more thanks to experts. The key is that they can problematize more and better thanks to experts. Their acts of problematizations, everyday acts of problematization, are better informed by experts, which should contribute to various virtuous things like public debate in a democratic society and so on and so forth. Okay, so just 3 minutes to final remarks. So this framework just described portrays, as I mentioned, an optimal, if not ideal scenario. And it is clear that in reality, we meet different scenarios of these two lines going in different directions. Thus, we can meet various deviations of the optimal setup. So we can just list some of these possible deviations. And most obviously, one scenario of deviation is when the expert line goes up while the non-expert line stays flat or even goes down. This is the basic schema of epistemic injustice, as described above. The injustice consists, among other things, in the fact that experts do not pay back, as it were, for the phase, for this period where they were nourished and allowed to develop their skills and conceptual frameworks. So another possible scenario would be a situation in which experts are incapable of producing high-resolution problematizations, and therefore the line goes flat before even they reach T2. So this portrays a society in the state of epistemic or institutional despair, either perpetuated generation after generation, or due to some, as a result of some particular catastrophe like war or natural disaster. And finally, my last point, my last minute, a very interesting scenario is when non-experts line goes up while the expert line is flat below. Then how is this peculiar thing possible? And remember that each such functional depiction is limited to a particular society. Therefore, some internal deviations may also point to external factors. In the situation just described, we could have something like an import of expertise. Thus, a situation in which non-experts are quite knowledgeable, but this does not result from the effort of local experts, but from purchasing the expertise from external sources on the market. And this schema may serve to represent very roughly what has been going on in the European Union. Oh, I'm a bit late with my presentation. And the European Union, as part of and as a result of integrating former post-communist countries such as Poland, Lithuania, or Hungary. And this is a very interesting empirical topic. And I'm about to investigate this particular thing, what we call institutional inaccuracy, under the supervision of Professor Łukasz Hart from the Department of Economics at the University of Warsaw. So this is, let's say, the more empirical part of this job, which is also at a very early stage. But this is a really crucial tool to understand what is going on, the dynamic of European integration, or at least part of this dynamic. And I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Opportunity break, and then I'll open the floor for questions.
I'm still online.
Yes, we'll stay online. So if in the meantime you want to, there's a button on top of the box to mute it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So now it's red, and to unmute it, you'll see it turn green.
Thank you for that. Introduction to my talk on Friday. Right?
I really find this coincidence just great. I mean, these two things fit together so well. At least I hope that my talk can fit.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've had to struggle with the way in which social scientists kind of define institutions as rule following versus the colloquial definition of like large formal organizations, funding, and result.
It's a mess there.
It's a mess there, yeah. I try to always flag which one I'm using now, like when I think about things, because when you say institutions, to most people they're like, oh, you mean like universities and government
Yes,
agencies.
they are good examples, but still there is no consensus as to what this concept actually is.
Exactly.
I don't know, perhaps we don't need precise concept.
But I had a social scientist yell at me that like we have to have the rule following definition or like the theories don't work, and I'm just like, look, you can't just take a word that everyone thinks means one thing and say it means something else and not flag it.
It's okay, but
It's fine.
to some degree, or to some things, to some jobs, let's say, it fits well. But as a general characterization,
think of, you said, like, the social science was like, playing how to play a saxophone. No one, if that's what you mean, that's great, but no one's gonna understand that. The kind of thing we normally talk about when we talk about it. Oh, so I don't know how you grapple. That wasn't the question I was asking, but I was wondering how you grapple with that.
Let's get started. Ravi.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. Really interesting. Okay, so my question about was this the graph that you had with the ideal scenario where you have the experts and non-experts like changing. So case that Maya Goldenberg has written about.
Who's me?
Maya Goldenberg or Goldberg, one of the two. Goldenberg. Okay. About vaccine hesitancy. Okay, so if I remember correctly, and anyone correct me if I'm wrong, but she's saying, okay, some people, they would criticize, anti-vaxxers as they would call them, which he wants to use because like being irrational or something, keep telling them vaccines are safe, but they're not listening, so there's a problem with them. And based on that understanding of reality, people started like public education efforts to like tell the masses that maybe they didn't know that actually vaccines are safe or something like that. But what happened after a while is that before people realize it's not working, we keep like telling the masses that science shows that vaccines are safe, and yet they're not listening. So what is the issue? And so she has this different reading of the situation where some of the people who will not use vaccines, for them it's kind of about a different question in a way, because they're not, they're more concerned about individual cases. Like, okay, we all agree that vaccines are not 100%. So which population is exactly vulnerable, and like what are the ramifications for them? And so for people who are interested in these kinds of questions, it's just not helpful to tell them vaccines are safe, because they're asking different questions. And so the way that she's diagnosing the situation, there's a mismatch between the kind of questions that people on ground are asking and the kind of questions that scientists are at least reporting to have studied. And so I'm wondering, in a case like that, if she's right in her diagnosis, and if I'm understanding her correctly, but who's looking at other like God saying right? Maybe she's saying it's not right. Like in the ideal case, you have this, like gap. Maybe they should always be intertwined. But the question asking from lay people and the question asking from the expert, maybe they should always go together. Otherwise, nothing can like guarantee or I don't know. Like otherwise, the question asking by the expert can go on.
Yes, it's a really. Oh, sorry.
And one thing for that, you don't mind repeating yourself.
Maybe
Once
Chris,
again?
try pressing it again.
Oh, okay.
Konrad, if you don't mind repeating the question, like in a sentence for the audience online.
Yeah, sure. So the question was about, or the question referred to the issue of vaccine hesitancy, and there was a suggestion that that when people are told what to do, they may not be convinced, if I got it correctly, but because they ask different questions than the scientists, the experts investigating the issue of vaccines. And the question is how this depiction that I brought up in my presentation, how it fits, as it were, how we can describe the situation. Did I get it more or less?
Yeah, I will just clarify that. What I'm wondering about is whether it is good to see a question asking from experts and non-experts, to see them as separate.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Than, like, should we see experts as being able necessarily to ask better, to problematize better?
Sure. So yeah. Now a more fundamental thing for our online audiences is whether or not we should draw two lines and not just one line, actually, because this is the way in which I understand it. Because if we have these two lines distinguished, then they can go apart, and then we have a problem, let's say. So perhaps this is not a good model if we have two lines, or we have only, maybe a weaker point would be that it's not good that we have only one point where they cross each other. Maybe there should be many such points. And I would, my answer is yes. So this model, if I can use such a serious word here, is so simplified that it can be, and it should be, if it is supposed to work and or put into work in any more technical sense, it should be possible in this model to speak of various points where these two lines cross one another. And but still, this distinction made some kind of conceptual clarity possible, let's say, because at least in reference to certain cognitive or epistemic endeavors, there is this distinction between what experts are doing, somehow going far beyond what so-called ordinary people or non-experts can even imagine. And also, on the other hand, there are certain ways in which we make sense of the world in which we live that have nothing to do with what experts are doing, especially what scientists are doing. So we tell various stories, and these stories are supposed to make our surroundings more or less understandable and making sense. And these stories are not scientific stories. They are stories of many different kinds. So there is this distinction. I would insist that there is this distinction, but the question is how many crossing points we should allow for, in a sense. So generally, my answer is yes, meaning that there should be many such points where they cross, and still I would insist on keeping this distinction, at least for the sake of a theory or a model, let's say. And the example that you brought up is really great, because someone might say that really people don't want to be told what they should do or what they should believe in. Perhaps a better strategy would be to, from the top-down perspective of experts, to instruct people, or to show them, not even instruct them, to show them how this domain, very complex and moreover politically messed up, to tell the truth, but how this domain can be problematized by means of various specific, well-tuned questions regarding, for example, someone's individual condition, health condition, and so on and so forth. So the path should be, I guess, really in terms of questions, not in terms of beliefs, that you should believe this or that. It doesn't work, let's say, I suppose. I don't know to what extent it answers your question, but
Yeah, to follow on Ruby's question, I was gonna say, what do you think about my golden bird example? So thank you for putting that on the table to start with. It seems to me that you're right, that there's a space you want between experts and the public. I think it's really important, for example, to experts to raise issues the public hasn't thought of, and to raise problems. I mean, climate change is a classic problem that I don't think the public is particularly paying attention to, or ozone depletion, but we're really grateful the experts went, hey, there's this thing that you are all are causing with your practices, and maybe we should think about how to address it. But I also wonder how to keep experts focused on the problems and questions of the public. The public does have my golden bird example, or differences between breast cancer cures and breast cancer detection and breast cancer treatment. I mean, these are really sort of fraught questions about what we should be investigating versus what scientists who have a particular animal model want to just keep investigating because they have a system up and running. So there's this tendency for scientific research to end up diverging if left to its own devices. And I'm wondering if you think about institutions that should, to what extent, keep experts focused on the questions of non-experts or touch back with them. And this is partly, participatory research is supposed now shifting to this model of nothing about us without us kind of thinking, which I think, is really difficult to practice. But given how poorly supported participatory research practices are in institutions like universities, what should that mean for us in for funding systems?
Yeah, so the question is of a practical matter, I would say, and indeed a crucial one. And it refers, if I got it correctly, to how how it is possible for us to prevent this expert line to diverge completely from the non-expert line. So, which means that how should we, or how can we make these lines closer together or intermingle somehow, so that the questions and including research questions asked by scientists are more closely related to the concerns of people who are supposed to benefit from this research. So it seems that it makes sense to get them involved. So, okay, I will start from answering this thing, although I have no ready-made solution, I'm afraid. And then I will refer to the climate change remark, which is also very interesting. So when it comes to this practical thing, I guess that, well, actually it's a political question, because it's about how we organize not only epistemic dependencies, but also this balance of power. We can also speak about the relationship between experts and non-experts in terms of power. Let's be frank about it. It's not only about knowledge and epistemology. So I guess that people cannot be given institutions that would enable them to influence research. But at the grassroots level, from bottom up, these institutions should be somehow created. These institutions of influence should be created, to put it simply, by the people, let's say. And then they would be sufficiently powerful, if I can put it this way, to influence what is going on in academia. And this is not about any hostile struggle, let's say, or it is not necessary for this power dynamic to be about hostility in any sense. On the contrary, it should be about cooperation. But still, I would say that this is a political issue in the sense that it's about balance, a certain balance of power. So I guess that something like various focus groups investigating what are the needs of people benefiting or who's supposed to benefit from research, such focus groups should be set up to give the people room where they can express their concerns and their needs. So this is just one example, I guess, and universities are perfectly capable of organizing such focus groups. It's not beyond our capacity. So, but this is just an example. I'm afraid I have no ready-made list of how to make us all happy in this respect. And when it comes to just a quick remark about climate change, because this is really subtle and crucial issue. Namely, I would say that on the one hand, you are perfectly right that the very problematization of climate change was top down, as it were, but it depends on how we conceptualize it, because of course, people, ordinary people, non-experts, did not have the concept of climate change, but they experienced climate change at various places in the world. So in some sense, they did problematize that something is going wrong in the place where I live. And I don't remember such events from the past, let's say. And having such a problem articulated in my mind, I can call some experts to do something about it, to do something more, to conceptualize. And then the concept of climate change can enter the stage and do some work. But in some less demanding sense, if I can put it this way, I would risk the claim that people did have problematized climate change without having this concept of climate change. Okay, so.
Thanks, Konrad. I found all that really interesting, and I kept thinking maybe you would address what I'm about to raise in your answer to other questions. In some way, this is a follow-on, but I wanted you, it's really less question, more invitation to say more, to connect the first part of your talk about institutions and the demand for institutions and this ordering between the institutions that demand and rules, and tell me more about how taking the erotic approach is a better way of thinking about perhaps how to how such demand arises. So how do questions produce demand, perhaps, would be one way of bringing it, the cognitive availability, right? And the other then, from a more active perspective, can we use the question greater resolution, better resolution of questions as a tool for creating demand for institutions that, for some other grounds, we think would be the good ones to have?
Yeah, so the question was, or two questions correlated. One was about what is the connection between the erotic approach, so spelling out this whole issue in terms of questions, not beliefs, and the issue of demand, especially demand for institutions. So this is one thing. And another thing is whether we can use this scale of resolution, if we come up with any scale, because this was just an illustration, let's say, to improve our questions and then to improve our demanding. Okay, so when it comes to the second issue, I would say that yes, and perhaps this is exactly the practical purpose of this whole model, namely that you can have a demand for a particular rule, or you don't know what rule at some point, but for something at the institutional level to happen, when you have an acute, fine-grained representation of what is going on in your environment. So if we have a certain measure of resolution of questions, then this should influence the way in which we demand more and more or better and better institutions, if there is such a hierarchy, let's say.
I mean, I just want to inject that you said there a fine-grained resolution description of what is going on, and that sounds doxastic to me rather than erotic, right? Knowing what's going on. So how are the questions?
Okay, sure, but so it depends on how much you want beliefs to do, let's say, or how rich or how thick is your instead of thin is your conception of belief. So this goes directly to the issue of perceptual content, actually. If your conception of perception is that perception has propositional, not only conceptual, but propositional content, then of course beliefs are involved in perception. So first we need to have a belief, and then we are capable of asking a question. So I think that this is the core of the whole issue. I would rather argue in the domain of philosophy of perception, of course, which we have no time to dig into, of course. I would argue that this is a complete non-starter, I would say. I just can't get my mind around this idea that when I perceive this chair, I have a belief about this chair. I don't, believe me, I don't. Okay, just joking. So let me put it this way. We can, sounds risky, let's say, but I would put it this way. We can look at things and simultaneously asking and not claiming, let's say. So it is a doable thing, and there is a certain machinery, cognitive machinery behind it that I would postulate. And then we can, of course, go further and further and asking how it works, how we can set up some empirical conditions to test this hypothesis, and so on and so forth. And then, should I stop right now?
No, you've got a few minutes, there's another question.
Okay, so just a quick, when it comes to the issue of what is so beneficial in the erotic approach as distinguished from the doxastic approach. So and once again, this goes to this issue of perceptual content. So I would say this, that the whole domain of beliefs that we have, including perceptual beliefs, rests on something more fundamental. And this something more fundamental is not necessarily questions, because questions are only manifestations of what I would prefer to call acts of problematization. And it's very tricky because there is, to my knowledge, there is no philosophical literature on, not on questions, but on these acts of problematization. How are we capable of taking some part of our environment and making it an issue that, oh, this deserves my attention. Perhaps I would dig some more, ask about what this thing is, how it works, and so on. This is a very remarkable capacity. And I would say that we should pay more attention to this capacity before we start talking about ready-made beliefs about reality. So perhaps this is my answer for now.
I'm interested in peer research and in particular in bits of science where the question being asked in the first place is itself requires expert knowledge to understand and translate that. I mean, I'm in physics, so I think about physics, and if I think about sort of big ticket physics research costs that don't come out of some general research grant structure that really need major buy-in. If I think about building gravity wave detectors or particle accelerators or exploring the outer planets, I mean, these are projects where, in a sense, the public care a lot about them, but that caring is constructed in the sense that popular outreach by the physics community that's perfectly well aware that needs public support for what it's doing is carried out to, this is criticism, but to persuade the public that yes, we do care about exploring the outer planets, that yes, we do care about the Higgs boson, we do care about the early universe. And I'm struggling to fit that kind of science into this sort of expert, non-expert dialogue.
Yes, thank you. So the issue is how we can place such sciences as physics in this model, let's say, in which we have possibly not even one, but many different places where these two lines cross each other. So yes, it's. I was thinking about it too, and that's why by experts, what I had in mind was predominantly experts in either social sciences or somehow related to social issues. But when it comes to hard science like physics, I would say that we have, perhaps this is the case when we have only one, let's say, point at which they cross one another, but still there is such a point. And however naive it may sound, I would say that in principle, as I said, this is a very folk rendering of the issue, but in principle, the very beginning of people's inquiries into what is going on in the physical universe were quite common, let's say, and people are commonly interested in what is going on, how the universe works, and so on and so forth. So I think I would put it this way, that this general interest of the public, of non-experts in the functioning of the universe, it should not be spelled out in terms of epistemic dependence of physicists on non-experts. It would be absurd. But still, some of the questions that they pose, I mean, the physicists, at least historically go down to certain questions that people generally wanted to know answers to. So perhaps this historical analysis could give us this point at which they crossed one another. Although, of course, the red line of physicists is way up right now, and so we can hardly think of any point at which they come together once again. It would be absurd to think of such a thing, but still there is historically some point. Yeah, so I have no time also.
A small gift on behalf of the center.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll see you on Friday for Heather's talk, and on Tuesday next week for